Thank you very much, Micheline. We've seen that the U.S. Federal Board is also a big consumer and producer of open data. I think that's also a message for most institutions to follow as well, is that you're not going to just create, but you're going to be producing, using open data as well. So I think we have heard from the UK and now the US, and our third speaker is Bill McGuggich from the Republic of Ireland. He is the first CIO of Ireland. You have the floor, Mr. McGuggich.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and it is a pleasure and an honor to be here in the United Arab Emirates and in Abu Dhabi. It's my first visit, and certainly to date, what I've experienced has been exceptional. I suppose it would be better to start from a beginning of a passionate journey on open data. And over the past 6 years, I've been involved in the struggle and the striving to get open data into both the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland, and in fact, in a previous guise, was working with Andrew Stott in the Cabinet Office. I suppose if you look at the contextual situation in Ireland, we're a population of just over 4.6 million, which is about twice the size of the UAE, and it's about a 13th of the size of the United Kingdom. You'll see from this slide, the population is continuing to grow. Slightly larger, quicker rate than the UK, which is, as I say, a much bigger neighbour and closest neighbour to the east and the north. And our GDP is about 210 billion in comparison to the massive GDP of the UK. And I suppose from my perspective, it's been an interesting journey to look at open data and how that has helped open government across the whole of the British Isles. I may also say that these are my own views in terms of the future, and I echo Micheline's. I don't want to be sent back and put in a local jail for saying things that I may have stepped out the box on. But Ireland itself is well connected with airline routes coming out of Dublin to the US, both to the west and across the globe, and to the east back into Europe. It's a major transiting hub for people. It's a largely rural economy. 13% of the world's milk powder comes from 3 companies based in Ireland, and therefore the use of data, and we heard a very good one from the climate perspective. One of the big data projects I was involved in last year was to see whether we could increase crop yield, particularly a crop yield that would allow us to increase 1% GDP of the nation's output, on the back of the fact that if you know the weather data, you know the humidity data coming from your soil, you know the rivers, the flow rates, and then you can put fertilizer down in the right proportion, the right time, you can increase the very thing that enables you to improve the world's milk powder supply capability. So that the whole rationale is fairly strong in terms of economic priority of getting data, geospatial data out there as well. Educationally, a growing and improving educational situation. We've got a really quite liberal, open and improving situation in terms of youth education. But more importantly, probably on the bottom right-hand side, you'll find virtually every single large American technology company headquartered from an EMEA perspective in Dublin. So we have the large core component of the coding community with Facebook and Microsoft and Oracle, Yahoo, Twitter, Google. You'll see the whole group there arrayed in terms of the US capability. And in fact, 2 weeks ago, I was in Facebook headquarters at a thing I'll talk about later on, which is Code for Ireland, and the capability to harness the very philanthropic power of your own local community to develop some coding applications that match the open data output. But the main push towards the requirement for open data came from a move towards much more open government, and it was on the back of a major collapse in the economy experienced in 2008 and 2009, whenever government announced the first step into a recession. And in fact, in 2011, a major set of disturbances and parades and protests in Dublin itself, which saw tens of thousands of people out on the streets because of reducing standard of living, blamed largely around the government's handling of the fiscal situation and the banking crisis. This, obviously, with the bad loans and the bond market, etc., and the credit swaps and the derivatives issues, pushed us in Ireland to a much stronger view of how we could rebuild trust in government in terms of the new government that came in 2011. Rebuilding trust focused initially around freedom of information, which was not a new topic. In the late 1990s, the Freedom of Information Act was introduced and was actually amended in 2003, and therefore gave people legal right to access to information. I'll deal with this slightly later on in terms of some of the tensions that we now face around the open data community and the view that obviously was put forward by Andrew that open data is reflected in freely available data, and there are some tension there within the community. We also introduced, and that's in the process of going through at the moment, a protected disclosures bill. This is about whistleblowing. It's about the capability of individuals within organizations to openly release information through a chain to say we're unhappy with a decision or a piece of data that's flowing through the system. So the Whistleblowers Bill, as it's euphemistically called, is currently producing some really quite strong tensions in terms of the route ahead on open government. The Irish government, my minister, Minister Howland, in May 2013, just before I arrived, announced and issued a letter of intent to join what's called the Open Government Partnership. And you'll see around the table here, I hope you witnessed Michelin and Richard swapping views internationally. There's quite a large international fraternity around open government and how we learn from one another. And Ireland, slightly behind the drag curve, decided to issue a letter of intent in 2013, the intention to join the Open Government Partnership, which brought with it transparency, a view of accountability. An interesting one around citizen participation. That's a strange word, certainly from an official or an ex-official who looks at citizen participation as benefit, but also as a major issue in terms of some of the threats that come with it. And then, of course, technology and innovation. And I don't think the technology and innovation is in any way a hindrance or a constraint anymore. It used to be. It is now no longer that. It is a firm enabler of where we want to go. In the 31st of October last year at the Open Government Partnership meeting in London, my minister, Minister Howland, our previous minister, now I'm out in private sector, Minister Howland, Brendan Howland, announced an intention to do 4 things. And in fact, interestingly enough, I was behind some of the briefs that went into the announcement, although it came out of a different part of the department. But it signed Ireland up to do 4 things. Signing up to the G8 Open Data Charter, and if it's of interest to you, it's worth going and having a revisit of that G8 Open Data Charter to just see what the core tenets of that is. Establish a governance structure, an open data board. I think it's important to understand that there needs to be some form of strategy and governance relationship from government that signs in at the highest level. And you've seen that from both Andrew and Michelin in terms of the open data board structure. But structures are only as good as the people you put at the top of them, but more importantly, the people you put underneath that implement the actions that are going ahead. So an action to establish an open data implementation group, primarily to build capability. This is a much larger group to build capability and the capacity to deliver this capability. And then building an open data portal. I think we put an awful lot of emphasis on the open data portal and not on what it's for and how it's built in terms of the rule sets that go behind it in terms of machine-readable information. And one of the pushes that was pushed back to us whenever we went through citizen participation was the need to actually go out and catalogue some of the data that people knew was there but actually wanted access to, rather than just publishing everything in some form of unintelligible format that gave you quantum but not quality or usability. We published, and I was certainly a key member of the administration that pushed the open data agenda into Section 2.1 right at the front end. It was one of the top 3 tenets of the new Public Service Reform Plan that was published earlier this year by the Irish government in terms of where it wishes to go over the next 2 years and up to the running for up to the next election. My own experience is that it's not about the data. It's about the people who use the data and the organizations that can exploit it and do things with it. And they come in 4 colors or flavors. They come as government officials who largely lead policy. Information is power. They want to retain it. They do not want to release it. The targets for me whenever I was looking at this subject were very much a how do I bring consensus to the release of this information and not we can't give it out there because it's not clean enough and we'll hold on to it. Because actually there's a fear factor with government officials that will be an extra work involved once you release the data out into the open. The cost of fulfillment is always an issue because cost is, and government officials, certainly from my experience in the British Isles, was around budgets and how can you manage what you need to do within budgets and prioritise. And then the whole issue around I can easily constrain what I release because I can put a branding on it of privacy. If I want to stop something going out into the open, it's easy for me to turn around and scare people to death on the basis of personal privacy. And yet there's so much, as you saw earlier on, and certainly Richard's talk about the capability to anonymize, pseudo-anonymize data so that it is releasable, and there's no longer an excuse for why it needs to be retained. Then the subject matter experts. I call this Geek Factor. This is the majority of technologists who love to play with this stuff. They're data hungry. They're actually purists and they love process. They're in that category of data entrepreneurs, but they're hidden away largely. And when they're brought out, they bring huge value to the overall ecosystem. And then the civil society groups. They're disparate. They're highly vocal. Their constituency is one that you can't control. You can harness. You can bring influence from them to bear. But actually they're extremely focused and they tend to be issue-related and issue-focused. And then coming back around again, the very people that this benefits, the citizens, the outcome-focused people who are literally there to see what it's doing for them. They want improved services. They want to see reduced cost of the delivery of the services. And it's interesting to split the top 2 subjects, the government officials and the subject matter experts, who I believe are interested more in process and the data, from the people who and the organizations that are at the bottom, which are very much into outcomes-based focuses. And then splitting the left-hand group from the right-hand group, where you get data privacy and issues sitting in the left-hand 2 quadrants and the right-hand quadrants where we're looking at how we get the technologies and the products out into the marketplace. But we've seen the 3 areas of improved public services, economic and social value, and transparent government as the core drivers. It's an easy slide to put together. It's much harder to actually make it have impact at the other end. It's all good and it all sounds good, and the nirvana of open data is there, but as Richard so eloquently pointed out, there's huge opportunity locally to be able to get that open data and make it a usable and rich output product. You'll see it from a perspective of health. This is one I screen scraped from Melinda Gates around the fact that India has seen a huge increase in vaccination rates. Well, actually, in Ireland, we've done the same type of, it looks a little bit more complex and it's not as pretty, and you won't be able to read it, I'm sure. But from that perspective, with a large migrant population coming in from Europe, it's quite interesting to see that we don't meet the European target or the World Health Organization target for immunization in our children in certain areas of Ireland. And that allows us to make much more informed and improved decision-making as to where the money goes to help us get to a situation where we have well-being of our future population in mind in terms of open data. We take an area, for instance, where this is a private application which does about building control and building regulations and, more importantly, building planning, but it's powered behind the scenes by a huge push that came out of that fiscal deficit that we ran through, because actually our revenue commissioners who bring taxes in had to create a very, very accurate property database called the Geo-Directory and Locational Property Database so they could collect a new set of taxes on land and property tax. Well, that underpins a geospatial relationship now to a planning application which is put in by a business with a geospatial reference point that now covers the whole of Ireland. And it allows a small company like this, mypp.ie, to become a fairly major contributor to planning awareness in your local area. But more importantly, the company can also keep people and hold people to account, because those red dots are the places where the local authorities are not releasing the requisite planning permission, so they can bring in compliance and regulatory without us having to fund that ourselves. We also can look at Dublin, a city which is, if you've ever driven through it, is quite interesting drive, but it's more importantly a very difficult place to find any parking. So you can actually use open government data from Dublin City Council to start paying and making payment for your parking much easier, and finding the slots actually that allow you to put your car somewhere where you're not going to be clamped and then come out and find you can't move from A to B. You can fix your street. Many areas now have this type of capability where that you can actually report through the system fixing your street into the local authority. And there's now a competitive market in this, both north and south of the border, where this one comes from the north and the previous one comes from the south. I suppose it also brings in, and we've seen them before, but this is slightly different format. It's much more in a metro-style Windows base, where you can see the size and shape of local authority spending and brings people into an accountability route in terms of local government. And also as a nation, we can sit here with the European Union, a set of benchmarks. Ireland is a small bubble on the right-hand side which has got the worst greenhouse gas emissions per capita as per the data, which allows us to then put into to place some policy making around the open data release and how the European Union has taken national data and spun it round and pointing it back to us. But there is inevitably a series of tensions that comes with this type of move forward. This was in last week's Independent, the local newspaper in Dublin, where my previous minister was being taken to task about the fact that we should have, as individual citizens, the right to information is not a luxury, but more importantly, it should be free. And on the other side, where government charges for freedom of information and data coming out. And largely some of that is around the fact that if you pay, you value, and actually even if you pay only a small amount, it stops people putting in multiple freebies in terms of requests for information. So there is a happy medium, I believe. And then finally, just to sum up, I think change also delivers benefits, and we have to work on the basis of the people who will take the data and make that raw product into something valuable. We've just literally in Ireland over the last 3 months set up and followed on from an organisation called Code for America with the launch of Code for Ireland, and that's mobilising engagement of individual software coders who have, I suppose, nothing better to do. That's not what they would say after 5 o'clock in the evening or 6 o'clock in the evening, but they come on board once a month and they do mashups. They take data, they work together in a highly invigorated way. One small project that they're embarked upon is the fact that 50%, and this was news to me when I helped launch this in Dublin Castle in January, but 50% of the responses of the fire and rescue authorities in Dublin are to cardiac issues in terms of heart attacks in the street. And the fire and rescue people are not the first responders. It's a local person or a local business or a local company, and nobody knows where defibrillators are. So when the software coders and the fire people were sitting in the group, in the small task force, they came up and talked about the fact that wouldn't it be a good idea if we got the kids in schools to do a selfie competition of photographs against themselves and a geo-located smartphone picture of a defibrillator and put that into the database, and allowed a participation of the community to build a database that the fire and rescue people could then build on. Now, it's in the process of being developed as we speak, in a crowdsourcing manner, so I don't know where it's going and whether it will be successful. But it was just one of those ideas that came out so strongly from Code for Ireland and wouldn't have been there 3 months ago or 4 months ago, where people were brought together and need was answered with capability. And then finally, it is alive. Open government is alive and well, hopefully, in Ireland. We've got the Open Government Partnership and conference coming up next week. But I think I'll leave you with a few final points in terms of where I think we've got to make sure that open government survives. First of all, we've got to make sure that there is a strategy in place to get open government as part, and open data specifically, as part of the future for any administration. We've done it, and I helped to do that in Ireland. We need to, I think I pointed out, consider the groups that get involved in this open data. It's one thing to produce these ones and noughts, this fuel that goes into making a new regime, but actually get the groups involved. And then obviously we want, and I think everybody should look at the opportunity to exploit it with a stakeholder group that actually is in place in the local community that empowers citizen participation. So thank you very much indeed, and I hope that was interesting, and I left some details up there.
Thank you very much, Bill. I think the focus here was on people, so you have a very good, diverse set of presentations from the UK, Ireland, and the US. I'm going to allow time for a few questions because we want to have a more of an interactive forum. So anyone with a question for any of our three panelists, please raise your hand. Yes, please. Stand up, please. It depends if he's... There's a mic coming next to you. We'll just wait for the mic.
My name is Sofian Barghouti from the National Bureau of Statistics, and I would like to thank you all for this grateful forum. My quick question, just to make sure the use of the time, is related to when we talk about the open data, are we talking about harmonized one, or in some cases we are talking about, for example, the open data for the Ministry of Interior, the open data for the Ministry of Health, etc. And at the end of the day, our goal is to utilize the use and the impact of this open data or the new goal. So what are the efforts, what are the best practices based on your experience to have in place to make sure that at the end of the day we are not misusing the available resources or the open data itself? If the decision maker found different data sets, or shall we go for a harmonized open data center, for example, on that? And thank you.
Thank you. Any more questions? If anyone else in the audience would like to ask a question? Yes. Oh, you have some questions. Okay. Okay. Actually, we have a number of questions, and they're all anonymous users. All right. What are the governance structures for open data used in the speaker's countries? What are the risks of open data on government? What's the most difficult challenge that you've met as chief data officer? And the last one, what are the qualities required of a chief data officer? I guess someone wants your job eventually here. So we have actually 5 questions, 1 from the gentleman and 4 from the audience. And I'll leave it up to you guys to take 1 minute each to answer whichever question you feel comfortable with.
Okay, I'll take the question from the person who was brave enough to identify himself. I think the experience has been that in terms of harmonization, it's very useful to pull all at least links to all the data available from all the ministries, pull the links together into one place, which is often called an open data portal. Sometimes it's actually the Bureau of Statistics that are best placed to run that. I think it's important to, that's important because people looking for the data don't necessarily know which ministry would be holding that data. The government of the Russian Federation launched an open data initiative and published nearly 1,000 data sets, but they were very difficult to find because they were on individual ministry websites, and the Russian government have now put together an open data portal which has links to all those. And it's now much easier to find. So my recommendation would be at least have all the links in one place. Sometimes the portal itself holds the data, sometimes the data is held in the individual ministries. It's the internet, everything can be linked. But if you have one place where you can search for it, where there's the metadata for it, and you can explore the data, so much the better. I think there is a very important role in harmonizing the standards for that data, but the experience is don't let the best become the enemy of the good. That it's often the publication of the data that then drives the pressure for harmonization and improvement of the quality of that data, rather than waiting for, making a massive investment at the start and delaying the release of that data, trying to get the quality in. And what we've tended to do in the UK is try and put the quality and the harmonization of the data in for those data sets that people wanted harmonized, and say, well, we've tried to use it, but it would be much easier for people to use if you improved it in this way, if it was in this format, if you used the same statistical classification for each data set.
Thank you, Andrew. Bill?
Yeah, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the dangers and the organizational structures. There was a question around that. I think the danger from open government is not doing open data, and there is also then the danger of what happens when you do it. We were quite clear that, and good practice I believe is getting ministerial and political buy-in right at the highest level as the first direction of travel in terms of open government and open data. The next one then is to get a representative body at small but powerful as the Open Data Board, and then have an implementation group that goes out that is far more broad with stakeholders involved. Because the risk is that information may be power, but a lack of information may be revolution. And from that perspective, there's a fair degree of policy making work that needs to go on in that environment. The second thing from my perspective is that there's a huge disparate group of people out there with different agendas in terms of getting data actually out there in a usable format. Some of them will gel and fit nicely with government policy, and others will not. And therefore you have to have that capability to manage the boundary layer between organizations and citizen advocacy groups and participants.
Thank you. Micheline, you have the last word.
Sure. So I'll address the ones on the Chief Data Officer. The biggest challenge by far in being a Chief Data Officer, and this is my second time in this role, is the culture change required for organizations generally, either in the public or the private sector, to really manage their data as an asset and be able to leverage it strategically as an asset. Typically, most organizations not born of the 21st century, have a lot of legacy. There's a lot of power and information, as Richard had alluded to earlier, directly spoken to earlier, as one of the survey results. People like to hoard. People don't like to share even within organizations. And changing that mindset takes an awful lot of time and an awful lot of resources. So actually, one of the person who leads my PMO is a senior change manager, not a project manager, so that we can deal with the cultural changes necessary to be successful and sustainable more effectively.
Thank you very much. I think we give a round of applause to our panelists, and we thank them again for excellent presentation. Just for a heads up for the next session, we had actually built in an extended lunch, so do not worry, you'll have your full hour of discussion, so don't worry about that. Again, thank you, panelists. Please enjoy the rest of the day. Your work is done.